Today, when people look at the map of the Middle East, two names frequently appear in reports filled with tension: Israel and Iran. Images of missiles, emergency meetings among world leaders, warnings, and exchanges of threats lead many to believe that this is simply a confrontation of modern politics. But if we step back for a moment and look deeper into the flow of history, into the stories told thousands of years ago in the sacred pages that millions of people around the world still read every day, we return to a time when the world had no national borders like those we know today. A time when vast deserts stretched beneath star-filled skies, and nomadic tribes moved from one land to another. In the quiet stillness of an ancient desert night, a man once heard a call that would completely change the course of his life. He was only an ordinary herdsman. His name was Abraham. And the story begins with that very man. He was not a famous king or a celebrated general. From the outside, his life seemed rather stable. He had a family, he possessed wealth, and he held a respected place within his community. Yet beneath that stability lingered a quiet sorrow that few people could truly understand. His wife, Sarah, could not have children. In the ancient world, childlessness carried a meaning very different from what many might think today. Children were not only the joy of a family. They were the future, the continuation of a lineage, the living sign of hope for generations yet to come. To have no children meant that the future of an entire household seemed to close in silence. It was precisely within these seemingly ordinary circumstances that something extraordinary occurred. Abraham heard a call from God. This call was not merely a piece of advice or a small direction for his life. It was an invitation to step into an entirely new journey. He was asked to leave his homeland, to depart from the land that was familiar to him, to walk away from everything he had spent years building. There was no detailed map, no clear plan, only a promise that he would be led to a new land. And that promise was far greater still. Abraham was told that from him would come a great nation, a lineage so numerous that it could be compared to the stars scattered across the night sky. And through that lineage, blessing would reach many nations of the world. What made this promise so remarkable was an undeniable reality: Abraham and Sarah still had no child. Yet Abraham chose to believe. He left his city and began a long journey across unfamiliar lands. Tents were raised and then taken down again. Herds moved slowly through dry valleys and sparse fields of grass. In many places along that journey, Abraham built simple altars of stone. These were not merely markers along the road. They were signs of a deep faith. That the promise he had received, though not yet visible, was quietly moving closer to the day of its fulfillment. Time is a unique test of faith. At first, the promise God gave to Abraham shone like a bright light in the future. But as the years passed without any sign of change, that light began to seem more distant in human eyes. Abraham continued living in tents, continuing to move through unfamiliar lands. His herds continued to multiply, and his wealth kept increasing. But the most important thing, the child of the promise, still had not appeared. Sarah, the wife who had walked beside him through that long journey, felt the weight of the waiting more deeply than anyone else. With every passing year, hope seemed to grow more fragile. Finally, in a moment that was both practical and desperate, she made a proposal. In their household there was an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. According to the customs of many ancient societies, if a wife could not bear children, she could give her maidservant to her husband to bear a child in her place. The child born from that union would be considered part of the family. From the perspective of that era, this was neither strange nor scandalous. In fact, similar arrangements were recorded in several ancient legal codes as a legitimate solution for preserving a family line. And so Abraham agreed. But there are decisions in life that, though they may appear reasonable at the time, carry consequences no one can foresee. Hagar became pregnant. And the moment it happened, the atmosphere inside Abraham's tent began to change. The maidservant who once held the lowest place in the household now carried within her what Sarah could not have. A subtle change in the way she looked, a shift in attitude, small things that gradually wounded Sarah's heart. The tension quietly grew day by day. Words of accusation began to surface. Emotions that had been buried for years suddenly erupted. And eventually, Sarah began to treat Hagar harshly. Not long afterward, Hagar did something desperate. She ran away. Imagine the scene. A young woman, pregnant, leaving the tents of her masters and stepping into the vast wilderness. No protection, no reliable source of water, no assurance for the future. Only sand, wind, and loneliness. Yet in what seemed like the most hopeless moment, the story turned in an unexpected direction. The Bible tells that Hagar encountered a messenger of God beside a spring of water in the desert. He asked her a very simple question: where had she come from, and where was she going? The question was not asked because God did not know. It was an invitation for a wounded heart to speak. Hagar answered that she was fleeing from her mistress. Then she received a difficult instruction: return. But along with that instruction came a promise. The child within her would not be forgotten. His descendants too would become so numerous that they could hardly be counted. The child was given the name Ishmael, a name that carries the meaning that God had heard her cry. It is a deeply moving detail in this ancient story. Even when human beings make mistaken choices, even when jealousy and pain fracture a family, God still sees those who are forgotten on the margins of the story. Hagar returned. And not long after, Ishmael was born. Many years had passed since the day Ishmael was born. In Abraham's camp, the boy grew up among the herds, the long journeys across the desert, and the stories his father told about the promise of God. To those around them, everything now seemed clear. Abraham finally had a son. Ishmael was strong and quick, and by all natural expectations, he was considered the one who would continue the family line. But the story of God rarely follows the simple logic of human beings. When Abraham was nearly 100 years old, something almost unbelievable was announced: Sarah, the wife who had waited her entire life, would bear a child. The old promise, which time seemed to have faded, was suddenly repeated with renewed power. And this time, the promise was no longer a distant vision. Not long afterward, the seemingly impossible happened. Sarah became pregnant. When the child was born, joy filled Abraham's camp. The boy was named Isaac, a name that recalls laughter. It was the laughter of astonishment, of joy, and of release after long years of waiting. But Isaac's arrival also brought profound changes within the family. For many years, Ishmael had been Abraham's only son. He had grown up with the natural position of the heir. But now another child had appeared, a child born from the promise that God had given long before. Complex emotions began to emerge. During a celebration when Isaac had grown older, Sarah noticed Ishmael laughing. The word laughing in that ancient story carries several shades of meaning. It could have been the ordinary playfulness of a young boy, but it could also have suggested mockery. Whatever the true meaning was, Sarah's reaction was unmistakable. She felt that the two boys could not share the same future within the family. In her eyes, the son of the maidservant could not inherit alongside the son of the promise. So Sarah asked Abraham to make a painful decision: Hagar and Ishmael must leave. For Abraham, this was not an easy request. Ishmael was his son, the child he had watched grow for many years. The thought of parting from him must have weighed heavily on a father's heart. Yet in the end, Abraham did what he believed was in harmony with the greater plan of God. Early one morning, as the first light of dawn touched the desert sand, Hagar and Ishmael left the camp. They carried a little bread and a skin of water. There was no escort. No large supplies. Only a path leading into the vast wilderness. When the water began to run out and hope nearly disappeared, Hagar placed her son under a bush and sat some distance away, unable to bear watching what she feared might happen. But once again, the story turned. God heard the boy's cry. Hagar was reminded that Ishmael's future would not end in the desert. A source of water appeared before her, and from that moment hope was restored. Ishmael grew up in the harsh wilderness, becoming a skilled archer, accustomed to the life of nomadic tribes. Isaac, meanwhile, remained in Abraham's camp, continuing the lineage that God had promised long before. From those two boys, two paths of history began to diverge. Two lineages. Two stories. And both began with the same father. Isaac's life then unfolded into a new chapter in the long story of the promise. Isaac grew up in the land where his father had wandered for many years. His life was not as dramatic as Abraham's, yet it carried something profoundly important: the covenant was still being passed on. Later, Isaac had two sons, and among them, the one named Jacob became the central figure of the next generation. Jacob's life was not a straight path. He experienced family conflicts, long journeys of wandering, and many years living far from his homeland. But one fateful night beside the bank of a river, Jacob had an experience that completely changed the course of his life. After a mysterious struggle with a divine messenger, he received a new name. That name was Israel. From that moment on, the story was no longer only the story of one individual. It became the story of a nation. Israel had 12 sons, and from them emerged 12 tribes. The foundation of the nation of Israel in later history. Their journey was filled with upheaval, from descending into Egypt during a time of famine to many generations living under the harsh reality of slavery. Then came the day of liberation. A long journey through the desert, where a people learned to trust God amid severe trials. At last, they entered the land that had been promised since the days of Abraham. Yet even after possessing the land, their story continued to pass through many cycles: the era of the judges, the age of kings, the division of the kingdom, and invasions from powerful empires. There were periods when they lost everything. Their land was taken. Their temple was destroyed. Many were carried away into exile. And yet, the remarkable thing in the story of this people is that they did not disappear from history. Despite countless times of scattering and wandering, the lineage of Israel endured. The promise once spoken beneath the star-filled desert sky seemed to continue its quiet journey through the generations. And it was during one of those painful periods of exile that another nation entered the story in a very unexpected way. It was the Persian people, the ancestors of the land we now call Iran. As the story of the people of Israel continued to move forward, history led them into one of their darkest periods. Mistakes, internal divisions, and the weakening of their kingdom left them unable to withstand the power of the great empires rising across the Middle East. Eventually, Jerusalem was attacked. The city was destroyed. The temple, the most sacred symbol of the nation, was reduced to ruins. Many Israelites were taken far from their homeland into exile. They were brought to Babylon, a mighty empire situated along the great rivers of Mesopotamia. There they lived as a people without a land, carrying within their hearts the memory of Jerusalem and the ancient promises that had once defined their identity. To many observers at that time, it seemed that the story of Israel had come to an end. But history was preparing an unexpected turning point. From the east, a new power was rising, the Persian Empire. Under the leadership of a king named Cyrus, the Persian armies advanced toward Babylon. When that powerful city fell before the strength of Persia, a new chapter in the history of the Middle East began. Yet what made this moment remarkable was not only the shift in power. What made it extraordinary was the decision of the Persian king. Instead of keeping the people of Israel in exile, Cyrus issued a decree allowing them to return to their homeland. Not only that, he also permitted them to begin rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, the place that had once stood at the center of their spiritual life. For the Israelites of that time, this decision felt like an unexpected door of hope opening after many years of sorrow in exile. A foreign king, not from their own people, had become the one who opened the path for their restoration. In the religious memory of Israel, this event carried deep meaning. It revealed that God could act through people no one would have expected. Even foreign empires could become instruments within his greater plan. The Persian period that followed became an important era for the people of Israel. Many groups returned to Jerusalem. The first stones of the new temple were laid. A community once scattered and broken began to rediscover its identity. Yet even within the Persian Empire itself, tensions among different groups remained. There were conspiracies, struggles for power, and attempts to destroy the Jewish people. But through all these events, the people of Israel survived. What is striking is that during this biblical period, Persia was not remembered as a sworn enemy of Israel. On the contrary, many Jews of that era viewed the Persian Empire as part of the story of restoration that God was unfolding. It is difficult to imagine that many centuries later, the land that was once ancient Persia would become one of Israel's greatest rivals on the map of modern politics. After the era of ancient Persia, the flow of history continued to reshape the Middle East over many centuries. Empires rose and fell. Peoples migrated, blended together, and gradually reshaped their identities over time. Persia had once been one of the most brilliant civilizations of the ancient world. Before the great religious transformations took place, this land was deeply influenced by an ancient spiritual tradition that had endured for thousands of years. The cities, palaces, and trade routes of Persia once connected vast regions across the ancient world. But history never stands still. Centuries later, new waves of conquest emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Armies carrying a new religion began spreading across the Middle East. The ancient Persian Empire gradually collapsed under the weight of these sweeping changes. In the generations that followed, the land of Persia entered a period of profound transformation. Religion, culture, and social structures slowly evolved. New traditions blended with ancient legacies, shaping a new identity for this land. Over time, Persia gradually became known by another name, Iran. This was not merely a change in name, but the emergence of a nation layered with many levels of history, from the ancient heritage of Persia, to the influences of the Islamic world, and finally to the political upheavals of the modern era. In the 20th century, a major event completely transformed Iran's position on the political map of the world. A revolution brought down a long-standing monarchy and ushered the country into a new political system, where religion and state authority became closely intertwined. From that moment forward, Iran began shaping its role in the region in a direction very different from the distant past of Persia in biblical times. In many speeches and foreign policy positions, Iran expressed a firm stance toward Israel. The confrontation gradually became a familiar element in the political landscape of the modern Middle East. However, if we look deeper, we begin to see that this story is not simply a rivalry between two nations. Behind it lies layers of history accumulated over thousands of years. Where religious memory, national identity, and ancient narratives continue to influence how peoples understand themselves and how they view one another. And it is precisely at this intersection of history, faith, and politics that we begin to see the deeper lessons this story leaves behind. When we look back at the entire story, from Abraham's simple tent in the desert to the modern nations that now appear on the map of the Middle East, one thing becomes clear. The Bible does not merely recount history. It helps people see the spiritual depths hidden behind history. At the center of this story lies a lesson that is deeply familiar to the life of faith: waiting. Abraham and Sarah received a great promise. But between that promise and its fulfillment lay many long years of waiting. With each passing year, hope could appear more fragile in human eyes. It was precisely during that long season of waiting that impatience began to emerge. The decision to bring Hagar into the story was not the act of cruel people. It was the decision of people trying to solve a problem that seemed to have no solution. They sought a reasonable path according to their own understanding. But history shows that the shortcuts of human beings sometimes open doors to consequences no one could have foreseen. A small decision within a nomadic family in the desert gave rise to two different lineages, two stories developing in separate directions, and historical memories that continue to influence how peoples understand their origins. Yet if we look only at the division, we will miss another important aspect of the story. The Bible does not portray Ishmael as a rejected or cursed child. On the contrary, the story emphasizes that God heard his cry. He saw Hagar's suffering. And he also gave Ishmael a future. This reminds us that even in stories filled with conflict, the mercy of God still appears in the most unexpected places. Another lesson also emerges very clearly: nations do not live only by economics or military power. They live by the stories they tell one another. Stories about their origins, their ancestors, sacred promises, and the events that shaped their identity. These stories are passed from one generation to the next, and over time they become part of how nations see the world. That is why when leaders today speak about Israel or Iran, they are not speaking only about politics. Behind those statements often lie layers of collective memory, religious traditions, and historical understandings that have been formed over centuries. Understanding this helps us view the tensions of the modern world with deeper insight. Because sometimes, the conflicts we see today did not begin only with the decisions of current leaders. They are nourished by very old stories, stories that have lived in human memory for generations. A decision made out of impatience. A solution chosen out of desperation. An action that seemed reasonable in the midst of a difficult situation. Yet when such decisions unfold over time, they can create consequences that echo through many generations. Perhaps this is one of the deepest lessons within this ancient story. Human beings are often in a hurry. But the promises of God are never bound by human haste. They unfold according to his timing, slowly, patiently, and far beyond the vision of any single generation.